The cabin was farther out than I expected. We lost cell service almost an hour before we finally reached it, driving down a narrow dirt road that cut straight through the woods. There were no other cabins nearby, no streetlights, no signs, just trees on both sides and darkness stretching out in every direction. It was exactly what we wanted, a quiet weekend away from everything. The cabin itself looked normal enough, small, wooden. A single porch light above the door and nothing else around it. When we stepped inside, the place smelled old, but clean, like it hadn't been used in a while. There was no Wi-Fi, no TV, and barely enough signal to send a text if we stood near the window. That first night was quiet. Too quiet. By around 11:30 p.m., we'd turned off most of the lights and were sitting in the living room, talking quietly. Outside the windows, the forest was pitch black. The trees swallowed up whatever little light the cabin gave off. That's when I noticed something strange. A faint glow. At first, I thought it was a reflection from inside the cabin. I stood up and turned off the lamp near the window. The glow stayed. It was coming from outside, somewhere between the trees, not close enough to be near the cabin, but not far enough to be part of the sky. Just a soft, steady light, hovering at eye level in the woods. There were no nearby roads, no neighbors, no reason for any lights to be out there at all, and yet, whatever it was, wasn't moving. I stood there at the window for a long moment, staring into the trees. The light didn't flicker. It didn't sway. It just stayed there, steady and faint, like someone holding a lantern perfectly still. I asked the others if they could see it. At first they thought I was messing with them. Then one of them leaned closer to the glass and went quiet. Another followed. Within seconds, all of us were standing shoulder to shoulder, looking out into the woods. No one said anything, because the longer you stared at it, the more wrong it felt. There were no cabins nearby. We'd passed the last house miles back. No roads ran through that stretch of forest, and even if someone were hiking out there, which made no sense at that hour, the light wasn't moving the way a flashlight would. It was fixed, like it had always been there. Someone suggested it might be a reflection from inside the cabin, so we shut off every light and stood in complete darkness. The room went black, and the cabin suddenly felt much smaller. The glow outside didn't change. It looked closer now, not by much, just enough to notice. That's when one of us joked about it being someone messing with us. Maybe a local. Maybe another cabin we hadn't seen. The kind of explanation people give when they don't want to admit they're nervous. But no one laughed. After a while, we pulled the curtains closed and tried to forget about it. We locked the door, more out of habit than fear, and went to bed. I didn't sleep well. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to silence so deep it felt unnatural. No wind, no insects, nothing. I rolled over and checked my phone. 1:47 a.m. That's when I saw the light again. It was shining through a thin gap in the curtains, faint but unmistakable. I sat up slowly and watched it for a few seconds, hoping it would disappear. It didn't. I got out of bed and pulled the curtain back, just enough to look outside. The light was closer, much closer. It was no longer deep in the trees. It now sat just beyond the edge of the clearing, right where the forest ended and the open space around the cabin began, at about eye level. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding, and listened. That's when I heard it, a sound from outside. Not footsteps, not branches snapping, just the faint crunch of something shifting on the forest floor, like weight being adjusted, and then held still again. I stayed frozen, staring at the dark outline of the trees. The light didn't move, but I had the unmistakable feeling that whatever was holding it was now facing the cabin. I didn't move for a long time. I stood there in the dark, listening, trying to convince myself that what I was feeling wasn't real, that the silence outside didn't mean anything, that the light hadn't actually moved closer. But then it did something that erased every explanation I had left. It blinked, not flickered. Blinking would have been easier to explain. A bad flashlight, a dying battery. But this was different. The light shut off completely, and then came back on in the exact same spot, like someone deliberately turning it off and back on. I stepped away from the window slowly and went into the hallway, waking the others in whispers. We gathered in the living room, keeping the lights off, speaking quietly, like we were afraid the cabin itself could hear us. One of us suggested we grab the flashlight and step outside. No one volunteered. Instead, we watched from the windows as the glow sat there, unmoving, just beyond the clearing. It felt closer than before, even though it hadn't changed position. That's when a second light appeared. Farther to the left, same height, same color, perfectly still. No one spoke. Then a third light appeared, and then a fourth. They didn't come on all at once. Each one appeared slowly, seconds apart, until there were several faint glows lining the edge of the trees, spaced evenly, like they were marking something, or surrounding us. My chest felt tight as I realized something that made everything worse. They weren't scattered randomly. They were placed deliberately, in a loose arc around the cabin. That's when we heard movement. Not running, not footsteps, just slow, heavy shifting sounds in the woods, like weight being transferred carefully from one place to another. The lights stayed perfectly still. We locked every door, pulled furniture closer. No one even suggested calling for help. There was no service anyway. Then, without warning, every light went out at once. Total darkness. The woods swallowed everything. We waited. Seconds passed, then minutes. Finally, the porch light outside the cabin turned on by itself. I stared at the switch inside. No one was near it. And then we heard it. A single knock on the cabin door. Slow, deliberate, not asking to be let in, just announcing that something was standing there. No one answered the knock. We stood there in complete silence, staring at the door as if something would step through it on its own. The porch light stayed on, casting a weak glow through the small window, but we couldn't see anything beyond it. No shadow, no movement, just empty light. After a long moment, the knock didn't come again. We waited another minute, then another. Finally, one of us crept closer to the door and looked through the window. There was no one there. The clearing was empty. The trees stood still. No lights, no shapes, no movement of any kind. It was like the forest had reset itself. None of us slept after that. When morning finally came, the woods looked completely normal. No footprints, no marks in the dirt. No sign that anyone, or anything, had been standing out there the night before. We packed up and left early. On the drive out, we noticed something none of us remembered seeing on the way in. A small wooden post near the tree line, half hidden by brush, old, weathered, and nailed to it was a rusted metal hook. The kind you'd hang a lantern on. There were several more posts deeper in the woods, all spaced evenly, all facing the clearing. We didn't go back. And to this day, I still don't know who or what was holding those lights. But I do know one thing. They weren't trying to scare us away. They were already there, and we were the ones who didn't belong. The cabin was supposed to be completely isolated. That was the whole point of renting it. No neighbors, no nearby roads, just a single cabin surrounded by miles of forest. The owner even made a point to tell us that no one ever passed through the area, especially at night. We believed him. The first evening went smoothly. We cooked, talked, and eventually turned in early. Outside, the forest was quiet, in a way I wasn't used to. No distant cars, no voices, just the occasional wind moving through the trees. I woke up sometime after midnight. I didn't know why at first. Nothing had startled me awake. The cabin was dark, and the only sound was the faint crackling of the dying fire in the wood stove. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow ones. Not inside the cabin, outside. They moved carefully across the ground, stopping and starting, like whoever it was didn't want to be heard. I lay there listening, trying to figure out which direction they were coming from. The steps circled the cabin, not rushed, not random, intentional. I sat up slightly and checked the time on my phone. 1:12 a.m. I listened harder now, my heart pounding. The footsteps paused near one of the windows, then continued on. Whoever it was walked the entire perimeter, step by step. I didn't hear a single voice. I didn't hear anyone speak. But whoever was outside knew exactly where the cabin was, and they weren't lost. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, listening to the footsteps outside. They weren't heavy. Whoever it was moved carefully, placing each step with intention. I could hear the faint crunch of leaves and dirt, slow and deliberate, stopping every few seconds like the person was listening. Just like I was. I told myself it could be an animal. But animals don't walk like that. They don't circle. The footsteps completed one full loop around the cabin, and then stopped near the front door. I waited for a knock. I waited for a voice. Nothing happened. After a few seconds, the steps resumed, continuing around the cabin again. This time, they were closer to the walls, close enough that I could tell exactly where the person was by the sound alone. I slowly reached for my phone, careful not to make any noise. The screen lit up the room faintly as I checked the time again. 1:19 a.m. 7 minutes had passed. The footsteps were still there. I slid out of bed and moved toward the living room window, keeping low. I peeked through a small gap in the curtains, expecting to see a flashlight beam or a shadow moving across the clearing. There was nothing. The area around the cabin was completely dark. No lights, no movement, just trees and darkness stretching out in every direction. And yet, I could still hear the footsteps. They stopped directly beneath the window I was standing near. I froze. The sound lingered for a few seconds, then shifted slightly, like whoever was out there had turned their body. I imagined someone standing just a few feet away, head tilted up, listening. That's when I heard breathing. It was faint, but unmistakable. Slow, controlled breaths coming from just outside the wall. I backed away from the window slowly, my heart pounding. I woke the others in whispers. At first, they thought I was imagining things, but the moment they sat up and listened, the color drained from their faces. The footsteps started again, moving away from the window and toward the back of the cabin. We stood together in the dark living room, not daring to turn on a light. The steps reached the back door. They stopped. We waited. Nothing happened for a long time. Long enough that someone quietly suggested maybe the person had left. Maybe they'd realized the cabin wasn't empty. That's when we heard the sound that made my stomach drop. A hand brushing against the wood siding. Not scratching, not banging, just fingers, dragging lightly along the wall, moving slowly, as if feeling the shape of the cabin. The sound traveled from the back door toward the side wall, then stopped. Silence. We stood there, frozen, listening to our own breathing, waiting for whatever came next. Because by then, it was clear. Whoever was outside wasn't trying to break in. They were making sure we knew. They weren't leaving. The silence that followed felt heavier than the footsteps. We stood there in the dark, listening, waiting for any sound that would tell us where the person had gone. My ears rang from the absence of noise. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. Then, from somewhere outside, we heard it again. Footsteps, but this time, they were closer to the door. Slow steps approached the front entrance and stopped directly in front of it. I stared at the door, half expecting the handle to turn. It didn't. Instead, something pressed against the wood. Not hard, just enough to make the door creak slightly, like someone leaning their weight forward. I could almost picture it. Someone standing there, ear against the door, listening to us breathe. My phone buzzed in my hand, making me flinch. No service, no signal, just the time glowing on the screen. 1:27 a.m. That's when the knocking started. Not loud, not frantic. 3 slow taps, tap, tap, tap. Each one spaced out, deliberate. We didn't answer. The knocking stopped, followed by a long pause. Then, slowly, something slid across the door. Not scratching, more like fingernails or fabric brushing against the wood. The sound traveled downward, then stopped. That's when the footsteps moved again, but not away. They began circling the cabin faster now, not running, but purposeful. Like whoever it was had finished checking and was now deciding something. The steps grew louder, closer to the walls, no longer hiding. Then they stopped all at once. Every sound outside vanished. We waited, holding our breath, and then we heard it. A voice. Low, calm, too close. I know you're awake. The words came from directly outside the wall, not shouted, not whispered, just spoken quietly, like a fact. No one moved. No one responded. A few seconds later, the porch light turned on. We all stared at the switch inside the cabin. No one was near it. The light stayed on for a moment, then shut off again. And with it, the footsteps returned. But this time, moving away. Slowly, deeper into the forest. We listened until the sounds faded completely. None of us slept after that, because we all understood the same thing. Whoever had been outside wasn't trying to get inside. They already knew we were there, and they wanted us to know. They could come back whenever they wanted. Morning came slowly. None of us slept. We sat together in the living room, as the darkness outside gradually faded, listening for any sound that would tell us the footsteps had returned. They didn't. When daylight finally reached the trees, the forest looked normal again. Peaceful, still. If it weren't for the exhaustion and fear sitting heavy in our chests, it would have been easy to convince ourselves the night before never happened. We stepped outside carefully. There were no footprints, no marks in the dirt, no signs of anyone walking around the cabin. The ground was soft enough that something should have left a trace, but there was nothing. The area around the doors and windows was undisturbed, like no one had ever been there at all. We packed up early and left without talking much. As we drove away, I looked back one last time at the cabin through the trees. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement near the edge of the clearing. But when I looked again, there was nothing. Later that day, we called the owner to ask if anyone else had access to the property. He sounded confused, then uncomfortable. He told us no one lived nearby. No one worked in the area at night, and no one had been there the weekend before us. Before hanging up, he added something that stuck with me. "People usually don't stay more than one night out there," he said. I asked him why. He paused, then said, "They say someone likes to check if the cabin is occupied." We never went back. And even now, years later, when I hear slow footsteps outside late at night, I still remember that sound, moving patiently around the walls, not trying to get in, just making sure someone was home. We found the cabin online. The listing looked normal enough. A few blurry photos, a short description about complete privacy, and a price that was surprisingly cheap for how remote the place claimed to be. There were no reviews, but we didn't think much of it. Some listings are new. Some owners just don't bother. We booked it anyway. The directions took us farther than we expected. The paved road ended. Then the dirt road narrowed. Then even that disappeared into what looked more like a long trail than a driveway. We almost turned back twice, but eventually the cabin appeared between the trees, like it had been placed there deliberately. Too deliberately. The place didn't look abandoned. It looked unused. No decorations, no personal items. Just furniture, perfectly arranged, like a staged home no one actually lived in. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, no emergency numbers posted anywhere inside. That was the first thing that bothered me. The second was the guest book. It sat open on the small table near the door. No names, no notes, just blank pages, except for the very last one. Written in shaky handwriting were 4 words: "Do not stay long." I laughed it off at first, assuming it was meant to be funny. Some hosts like to mess with guests. Still, I turned the page. Nothing else was written. That night, as we locked up the cabin and turned off the lights, I kept thinking about that message, about how empty the place felt. Not just quiet, but untouched. Like the cabin wasn't meant to be lived in, just visited. We tried to ignore the message in the guest book. We told ourselves it was probably left there by someone trying to be funny, or maybe even the owner, as part of some weird theme. Still, I closed the book and put it face down, like that would somehow stop it from sticking in my head. The rest of the evening felt off. The cabin was clean, but it didn't feel lived in. The kitchen had plates and utensils, but no food. The shelves were empty. No books, no decorations, no photos. It felt less like a place someone stayed and more like a place someone passed through. That night, we locked the door and went to bed early. I woke up sometime after midnight to a sound that didn't belong. Not loud enough to be alarming, just wrong. It sounded like wood shifting, slow and deliberate. At first I thought it was the cabin settling, but the sound kept repeating, always from the same direction, outside. I sat up and checked my phone. 2:03 a.m. The room was pitch black. No moonlight, no glow from outside, just darkness pressing in from every side. I listened again. Footsteps, slow ones. They moved around the cabin, stopping occasionally, then continuing. Not rushed, not random. Whoever it was walked like they already knew the layout. I didn't wake the others right away. I wanted to be sure before I scared everyone. I slid out of bed and moved toward the living room window, keeping my steps light. I pulled the curtain back just a little. There was no one there. The clearing outside the cabin was empty. No flashlight beams, no shadows moving between trees. Nothing that explained the sound, but the footsteps continued. They moved past the window, then toward the back of the cabin. I could tell exactly where the person was by sound alone. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The sound wasn't coming from one set of feet. There were 2. They moved separately, out of sync with each other, circling the cabin slowly. One would stop while the other continued, then they'd switch. I backed away from the window and quietly woke the others. We stood together in the dark living room, listening. None of us spoke, because now everyone could hear it. 2 sets of footsteps, slow, patient, intentional. Then, without warning, they stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise had been. We waited, expecting something. A knock, a voice, anything. Instead, we heard a sound from inside the cabin, the soft creak of the front door handle. Someone was trying it. The door handle moved again, slowly, carefully. Not someone trying to break in, but someone checking, testing. Like they already knew it was locked and just wanted to confirm it. None of us moved. We stood there in the dark living room, watching the door, listening to the faint metallic sound of the handle easing back into place. Whoever was outside didn't jiggle it, didn't force it, they just tried once. Then the footsteps started again. Both sets this time. They moved away from the door and split. One set circling to the left, the other to the right. The sound traveled along the walls, stopping near windows, then continuing. It felt organized, planned. That's when one of us noticed something that made everything worse. The porch light was on. No one had turned it on. We stared at the switch inside the cabin. It hadn't moved. But outside, the light cast a weak yellow glow across the clearing, just enough to see the tree line. And that's when we saw them. 2 figures standing just beyond the edge of the light. Not close enough to see their faces. Not far enough to pretend they weren't there. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stood there, perfectly still, like they'd been waiting for the light to come on. My heart pounded as I realized something horrifying. They weren't surprised we were inside. They expected it. One of the figures stepped forward slightly, just enough for their shadow to stretch across the ground. The other stayed back, unmoving. Then a voice came from outside. Low, calm, almost polite. "You're not supposed to stay this long." The words hung in the air. None of us answered. The figure closest to the cabin tilted its head slightly, like it was listening for a response. Then it took one slow step backward, returning to the tree line. The porch light shut off. Instant darkness. The footsteps resumed, moving away, deeper into the woods, until they faded completely. We stood there for a long time after that, not daring to move, because the message was clear. We hadn't stumbled onto something by accident. We had overstayed. We didn't wait until morning. As soon as the footsteps disappeared completely, we started packing in silence. No one said it out loud, but we all knew the same thing. Whatever had come to the cabin that night hadn't been bluffing. We left before sunrise. The forest was still dark as we drove away, the trees closing in on the road like they didn't want us leaving. No headlights followed us. No movement appeared in the mirrors. Still, none of us relaxed until the dirt road finally met pavement again. Later that day, once we had service, we tried to look up the cabin listing. It was gone. The confirmation email still existed, but the listing itself led to an error page. The phone number for the owner rang once, then disconnected permanently. No voicemail, no explanation. Weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I searched the area online and found an old local forum post mentioning a cabin deep in the woods, one that hikers were warned not to use as shelter. According to the post, people who stayed too long reported being checked on during the night. No one ever explained who did the checking. The guest book still bothers me the most. Not the warning itself, but how it was written, like it had been added over time. Like other people before us had started to write something and stopped. Sometimes I wonder how many pages were torn out before we arrived, because whatever lived near that cabin didn't seem angry. It seemed patient, and the message wasn't meant to scare us away forever. It was a reminder. Some places aren't meant to be occupied, only borrowed, and only for a short while.